Thank you for joining us for today's Colonial History Lecture, Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, with Dr. Kathleen Duvall. The Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago with collections spanning more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. We've been free and open to the public since 1887. Following state guidelines for COVID-19 restrictions and for the safety of our community, the library is currently closed to the public and our public programs remain virtual. Visit www.newberry.org to learn more about our many digital resources, online classes, and virtual public programs like this one. I also encourage you to follow the Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, our staff, and stories that bridge the past and the present. You can also visit our online Rosenberg bookshop for your holiday shopping. You can purchase Dr. Duvall's latest book there, along with many other wonderful books and unique gifts. The co-sponsors for our Colonial History Lecture Series are the Society of Colonial Wars in the state of Illinois and the History Department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The Society for Colonial Wars is a national historic and genealogical organization comprising more than 4,000 members who trace their ancestry to a soldier, a sailor, or a government official who served in America between 1607 and 1775. Its mission is to perpetuate the memory of those who served, as well as events of the colonial war era, and to educate the public about the period. The organization sponsors lectures and publications and offers financial support to colonial era researchers and authors. Dr. Duvall's talk is the 10th in the Colonial History Lecture Series since our partnership began in 2016. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. During the program, please enter your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, Dr. Duvall will respond. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. You will join us. Dr. Kathleen Duvall is Bowman and Gordon Gray Distinguished Term Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her broad-ranging research focuses on cross-cultural relations on North American borderlands from the 16th through early 19th centuries. Her other books include The Native Ground, Indians and Colonists in the Heart of the Continent, and Interpreting a Continent, Voices from Colonial America, the latter co-edited with John Duvall. Now I will hand things over to Dr. Duvall for her lecture, Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Karin, and thank you to the rest of the Newberry staff, especially to Elizabeth Cummings, who I think is the most organized person I've ever had the pleasure to work with. The Newberry Library gave me fellowships to come to Chicago and do research in their amazing archives, both for this book and for my first book 20 years ago when I was a graduate student. So I'm especially excited to be part of this series. I want to give a big thank you to the Society of Colonial Wars in the state of Illinois and the University of Illinois History Department for co-sponsoring this talk, and especially to Philip May of the Society for Colonial Wars, a Society of Colonial Wars, for inviting me more than a year ago, back when we thought we would actually all be in Chicago together, and for seeing it through times that ended up being quite different from what we thought they would be. Elizabeth, if you want to start with the first slide. In March 1781, a British-held colonial fort was under siege. Troops from the colonies and from Europe surrounded it by land, while French and Spanish ships were rushing to blockade by sea and to keep supplies from coming in and British Navy reinforcements. Britain would lose and surrender this fort, and the loss would help to decide the British on a course that would end the war and make way for American independence. This was 1781, but this wasn't Yorktown. This was 5 months earlier at Pensacola. Now, even if you know a lot about the American Revolution, you may not know about the British loss at Pensacola. This part of the war is less known because Pensacola was part of the war between the British on one side and the Spanish on the other. The siege of Pensacola in 1781 was part of the American Revolutionary War that played out far from East Coast battlefields, from Boston taverns and Independence Hall. In fact, quite a lot of the Revolutionary War took place outside the 13 rebelling colonies, from India to Central America to Gibraltar to Fort St. Joseph, just across Lake Michigan from the Newberry, to a failed French and Spanish invasion of England itself. And although Americans today might be surprised to hear it, the British fought several battles against the Spanish along the Gulf Coast and lower Mississippi River, including at Pensacola. Now, supporting a rebellion against an empire was not exactly a natural choice for the Spanish, who had their own very large American empire. But the Spanish assumed that they would be able to control these English-speaking American rebels whose side they ended up fighting on. Now, the Spanish really didn't know much about Americans. Spain's ambassador to France during the American Revolution suggested, these Americans, many being Quakers, will be gentler neighbors than Britain. He would learn differently. But Spain, as it entered this war, did not ally directly with the rebelling colonies, but Spain declared war against Britain, as did Spain's ally, France. You can advance the slide, Elizabeth, if you would. In the American Revolution, Spain fought in as many battles, provided as many troops, and spent as much money and won more victories than the French. But the Spanish role in the American Revolution is less remembered than the French role, in part because to Spanish officials, this was not at all a war against empire. It was a war, in fact, for empire. The Spanish hoped to seize lands that had recently been taken by the British and begin a new era of empire building, to spread the Spanish Empire into the north. Now, as in every other part of the American Revolution, Europeans and their descendants were not the only people involved. American Indian nations fought on both sides of the conflict, as did enslaved and free blacks, including on the Spanish side, both free black regular army troops and militia troops. For all of the people involved in the war along the Gulf Coast, it was not a struggle against British political or economic tyranny. In fact, people living in this region would have been surprised at the prominent role that the revolution has assumed in American history. To them, the revolution was simply another in a long line of colonial wars. You can advance the slide, Elizabeth. Now, to step back a moment, most recently, the most recent of these colonial wars was the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. And I want to use this map for a moment to talk about how the geography of North America was split up after the end of the 7 Years' War, which in 1763. So if you look at the map, you see the Mississippi River right smack in the middle of the map. The French colony of Louisiana, until the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, spanned both sides of the Mississippi River. Now, you may remember that big map of the Louisiana Purchase that you can see that shows Louisiana as much bigger than just the state of Louisiana at the time that Napoleon sold it to Jefferson in the early 1803. But in fact, French Louisiana, from its early days at the beginning, the very end of the 17th century until the end of the 7 Years' War, was even bigger than that. It spanned both sides of the Mississippi River. So all that yellow shaded part on the west of the Mississippi and all that pink shaded part on the east, except for what's now the state of Florida. Now, this map shows how the continent was divided after the 7 Years' War. France lost, cleared out of mainland North America, and all of what had been French Louisiana west of the Mississippi went to Spain, and all, including New Orleans. So New Orleans was Spanish at the time of the American Revolution. And then all of that land that had been French Louisiana east of the Mississippi River went to Britain. And so Britain called this strip of land along the Gulf Coast that included Mobile and Pensacola, called that the colony of West Florida. And then the peninsula, what's now the peninsula of the state of Florida today, they got that from Spain and the sort of complicated negotiations at the end of the war. They called that East Florida. So this is southwest of Georgia there. You've got two new British colonies, West Florida and East Florida. So these are big changes on a map. Somebody here has taken an old map, and they took an old map in 1763 and colored it in to show these these changes. It also resulted in a transfer of power at posts, including New Orleans and Natchez and other places in this region. But American Indians actually controlled almost all of this land on the ground. And in fact, if you can look closely in at your screen, you can see all over this map are actually the names of native nations. This is a French map, so they're written in French, but you can see like the Chicachas or the Chickasaws or the Choctaws, or there's a T at the front, but that's Choctaw. So the Natchitoches on the western side of the Mississippi River. Even this European map maker has acknowledged that Native people control the ground on most of these places outside of posts like New Orleans and Natchez and Pensacola. Now, Native nations in this region responded to France's loss in the 7 Years' War by establishing new trading and diplomatic relationships with both the newly British eastern half of Old French Louisiana and the newly Spanish western half of Old French Louisiana, including New Orleans. So what I'd like us to do today in this talk for a little while is to put ourselves in the place of the people on the Gulf Coast. I want you to try to forget about the outcome of the revolution. Especially, I want you to forget about 19th century American history and what's going to happen in the years to come. Historians have often portrayed the Spanish Empire and Native Americans in the late 18th century as hopelessly behind the times, as destined to lose. In this myth, Spain was a crumbling empire, and Native Americans were supposedly primitive people who couldn't keep up with 19th century agrarianism. And in this view, the farms and plantations of the young American Republic were destined to cover the continent. Now, in reality, Spaniards, American Indians, and African Americans as well had changed their ambitions and their methods with the times. Spaniards were part of the Enlightenment, and they envisioned new forms of empire with freer trade and more rational bureaucracy. The vast majority of most Native Americans still lived in their own nations, autonomous, sovereign nations. And they assumed that they would determine their nation's futures and the future of the continent. And many enslaved and free Blacks along the Gulf Coast took advantage of living in a borderland under conditions of near constant war and rumors of war to carve out freedoms and opportunities that would be unimaginable in the 19th century Cotton South that the region would become. But wait, I said forget about the 19th century, right? Back to the 18th century. Now, in many ways, the peoples of the Gulf Coast were fighting for independence of various kinds. People on the Gulf Coast and everywhere in the Revolutionary War fought or stayed out of the fighting, debated and advocated for many different versions of independence: political, economic, territorial. Native people worked for similar kinds of political sovereignty and national independence that the signers of the Declaration of Independence sought. As in the 13 colonies, people along the Gulf Coast also made decisions based on more personal definitions of independence, protecting their homes and their families from imperial tyranny, promoting economic independence based on land and trade. And some people's independence came at the expense of others, most obviously enslaved people. Today, I'm going to focus on 4 people who were involved in the war on the Gulf Coast, this war between British and Spanish sides. In my book, I look at 8 people. I've chosen 4 to talk about tonight. 2 of the 4 people I'll talk about tonight were married. They were British loyalists. Their names were Isabella and James Bruce. And they were in Pensacola during that siege of 1781 that I mentioned at the beginning. A third person I will talk about was a French Acadian in Louisiana. And finally, I will talk about a Creek Indian leader. If you'll advance the slide, Elizabeth. Isabella and James Bruce lived in West Florida, one of those new British colonies that I mentioned that had been created at the end of the 7 Years' War. They lived in a British colony that did not join the rebellion. We focus on 13 colonies during the American Revolution, but in fact, in the 1770s, there were more like 26 British colonies in North America, from the Canadian colonies through the 13 we talk about most, through the East and West Florida, and into the Caribbean. James and Isabella were Protestant lowland Scots. Their ancestors had actually rebelled against the English crown, but it had been a long time ago. The lowland rebellions had ended with James Bruce's distant ancestor, Robert the Bruce, nearly 5 centuries before the American Revolution. So their families had long accepted being part of Britain. And the British Empire in the 18th century promised to Scots opportunities for economic and social advancement, the same kinds of opportunities that attracted hundreds of thousands of European men and women to the American colonies. James Bruce was a veteran of the 7 Years' War. He had been a low-level officer in the British Navy in the British triumph over French Canada. And for his service, for his military service, he was awarded a land grant of 4,000 acres in Britain's new colony of West Florida. It was a good opportunity. Across the British Empire, land, of course, was the basis for wealth and family independence. And you only have to watch a little bit of Masterpiece Theater to know that you can't just simply go out and acquire land in 18th century England. By the 18th century, it was hard to get land even in the established British colonies in Virginia or South Carolina. But the new colony of West Florida offered both land and security. While Native people in the north, from the Ohio Valley through the Cherokees and the Creeks, were defending the Appalachians as the western border of British colonies, trying to keep colonies like North Carolina and Virginia from going west over the Appalachians. The Choctaws and Creeks did not try to protect the Gulf Coast itself. Their vast land holdings and towns were inland, and the Creeks and the Choctaws and others in the region allowed European development near the Gulf Coast as long as colonists paid them with goods and respected their borders. Now, Spain had founded Pensacola in 1557, more than 2 centuries earlier, right? But Spain had never made money out of the Floridas. But British leaders were sure that Britons could succeed where Spaniards had failed. The new British governor of East Florida wrote in 1763, "The indolence of the Spanish," this is where some of this myth of Spanish decline comes from, "the indolence of the Spanish kept them from making use of what the soil and climate are capable of producing." So you can hear in his words, the idea of these new colonies of East and West Florida were that Britons would establish plantations there and then would grow and export indigo and hemp, cotton and rice and flour around the globe. James Bruce went to West Florida for 5 years. He worked there to figure out what lands he would be granted to build his business and his prominence within these sort of West Florida imperial dreams before he headed back to Scotland to find a wife. Now, as a woman, James Bruce's wife is harder to trace in colonial archives. I've only really been able to sort of guess at her identity before she married James Bruce, because of course, under English common law, women changed their last names. And so I don't 100% know what her last name was before she got married, because the later documents refer to her only as Isabella Bruce. But in trying to sort of pairing up dates, trying to figure out who she could possibly be, my best guess is that she was born Isabella Christie in Aberdeenshire in northeastern Scotland in 1742. That would make her in her mid-20s when she met James Bruce, when he was back in Scotland on leave. Now, as a landowner, he was a catch, but marrying him meant that Isabella would have to leave family and friends behind because his land was in West Florida. They married in August 1769 and boarded a ship for Pensacola a few weeks later. Approaching Pensacola from the Gulf on a ship was a disappointment. Now, the Bruces didn't write down their impressions, their first impressions, but another visitor wrote, "Anywhere else that one might enter a port, he would be curious to see the city. Here, however, one could already see from the ship that this must be a miserable place." Getting off the ship would not have changed your impression. The streets, if they can be called that, one arrival from Germany wrote, are full of sand, in which one walks with the sand like snow in Germany over the shoes, and in summer so hot that the sole shoes and feet are burned. Another writer didn't even try to describe Pensacola. He just wrote, "It is impossible to describe it bad enough." A British officer who was stationed in Pensacola remarked, "The place which is called the fort is really just half a mile of ground in circumference, surrounded with a rotten stockade, so defenseless that anyone can step in at pleasure." You call it a fort, but you can just step in and out. It's not really a fort. But the British, they were sure they were going to make improvements, and they did. A British civil engineer replanned the city and laid the streets out on a grid. And by 1770, West Florida had nearly 2,000 settlers and was growing. The Bruces acquired land based on the land grant that James Bruce had gotten, and they bought enslaved people to work that land. Like most ambitious colonists, they would build their fortune on the backs of enslaved men and women. The Bruces were becoming landed planters, and as they had children, they hoped for prosperous futures for their descendants, all built on colonial land, British markets, and the British slave trade. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, West Floridians were not happy about it. As in other British port cities, people in Pensacola marched to demand the surrender of the stamps when they arrived at port. They accused the ship's captain of importing, they wrote, badges of slavery. Now, it's not hard to find examples of people in American history who owned slaves themselves, and when they felt they were put upon by tyranny, immediately reached for the metaphor that made a lot of sense to them, which was of slavery. They knew that being enslaved was not something that they wanted for themselves, and they used that language in protest. But when delegates from 9 colonies sent a resolution to Parliament and the King protesting the Stamp Act in 1765, West Florida did not join them. And ultimately, West Florida would not join the revolution and the independence movement that followed. The Bruces and their neighbors felt they owed their newfound wealth and prominence to the British Empire, and that it would be crazy to try to leave it. In the early years of the American Revolution, colonists didn't define the choices of the Bruce family as, on one side, the heroic patriot or American side, and on the other side, the sort of cowardly Tory or loyalist side. Our founding fathers who founded this nation at the time needed people to believe those were the choices. But that wasn't how most people early on saw them. Through the mid-1770s, rebellious colonists were still having to defend their choice. The Declaration of Independence goes to great pains to explain that it was not light and transient causes that prompted independence, but, as Jefferson put it, a long train of abuses and usurpations aimed at instituting absolute despotism. In the minds of the Bruce family and many, many other people, the causes that the Declaration of Independence listed were not long-standing or abusive enough to justify what they saw as treason. And they also believed the rebels were going to lose. In 1775 and 1776, American General Richard Montgomery and Colonel Benedict Arnold, still on the American side, failed in their attempt to take Canada, and Montgomery was killed. George Washington led his troops in desperate retreat out of New York City and across New Jersey to Pennsylvania, with British General Charles Cornwallis on their heels. But when France and Spain joined the war against Britain, Pensacola seemed vulnerable. The Bruces could hear the constant sound of the troop drills and the noise of building fortifications, trying to build up that fort that you had been able to just step into, make it into a real fort. Creeks and Choctaws and other native delegates crowded into town to get news and supplies. Elizabeth, you can advance the slide if you don't mind. And in September 1779, James came home with terrible news. Spanish troops had marched out of New Orleans and taken the British posts, West Florida posts of Baton Rouge, Natchez, and the surrounding land that included some of the Bruce's plantations on the Mississippi River. Then Spanish troops and ships besieged and took Mobile, also part of West Florida, in 1780. And in the spring of 1781, Spanish ships and overland troops arrived to begin their siege of Pensacola. So let me shift back, since I brought us to Pensacola with the Bruces, let me shift back to another person who will come to that siege, but on the side of the Spanish. Elizabeth, if you don't mind forwarding the slide. Amman Broussard. Amman Broussard was born around 1750 in Acadia, what's now Nova Scotia, Canada. At the time, which was part of French Canada before the 7 Years' War. But he was born into a time of increasing conflict between France and Britain. The 7 Years' War turned the Broussards' homeland into an imperial battleground between France and Britain. Amman was a young boy, but his father, uncle, and older brothers all fought for France. But despite the resistance of the Broussards and other Acadians, French forces steadily lost ground. Quebec fell to the British in September 1759, and the British captured the entire Broussard family, including little Amman, and held them in a prison in Halifax for 3 long years. After the 7 Years' War ended, the British forced the Broussard family onto a ship along with several other Acadians and sent them into exile. In fact, 15,000 Acadians, whom the British expelled 15,000 Acadians and sent them all over the Atlantic world in the process of seizing French Canada. For his whole life, Amman Broussard had been on the run from or imprisoned by the British. The Broussards arrived in New Orleans early in 1765. His father and his uncle had not been able to save their homes or their country, but they led the family to safety and a new life in Louisiana, and the Acadians would become the Cajuns of Louisiana. As the Acadians took up their land and settled into their new homes, Amman Broussard married a fellow Acadian refugee and began to drive cattle on the trail that followed the bayous to New Orleans. By the time that the American Revolution broke out, Amman had made enough money in the cattle trade to buy his own house and land. He and his neighbors wrote to fellow Acadians who were dispersed all around the Atlantic world about the goodness of the soil and climate of Louisiana and the wealth to be made there. Louisiana's Acadians had not forgiven the British for their years of war and imprisonment and exile. And that is how Amman found himself on September 7th, 1779, surrounded by his brothers and cousins, just south of the Iberville River, near the border between Spanish Louisiana and British West Florida. Amman could see above the crowd Louisiana's governor, the Spanish governor of Louisiana, Brigadier General Bernardo de Galvez. He was on his horse above the crowd. It was a big crowd by then. There were 1,300 armed men. The over 600 militiamen included French-speaking Louisianans, both Acadians like Broussard and his family, and other Frenchmen who had settled, whose ancestors had settled in earlier decades when Louisiana was French. Some of the militiamen were British refugees who left West Florida seeking Spanish protection. At least 80 members of the New Orleans Free Black Militia were there. They served in segregated units with their own Black officers. There were about 500 regular Spanish troops plus 20 light cavalry. And they were joined by 160 Homas, 6 town Choctaws, Alabamas, and other Indians of the lower Mississippi. 7 Americans were there, marching under an American battle flag. Governor Galvez, the Spanish governor of Louisiana, had assembled this sort of fairly diverse group of fighting men to attack British West Florida. When Galvez told Amman Broussard and the other Acadians in Louisiana that Spanish King Carlos III had declared war on Britain and expected the people of Louisiana to do their part to fight the British and to take British West Florida, they did not hesitate. To the Broussards, along with their neighbors on the Gulf Coast and decision makers in France and Spain, including their kings, the rebellion was simply a spark. The real war was on now. It was the global war. American rebels, leaders in Philadelphia, eagerly anticipated that Spain's powerful assistance, both military and sort of financial, would open an additional front in mainland North America and establish a combined fleet that was bigger than Britain's. Most people elsewhere saw the conflict as a rematch of the 7 Years' War, another one of these colonial wars they'd gotten so used to seeing. This war, this new war, would either restore the French and Spanish to their previous imperial prominence, or, on the other hand, if Britain won, the war would solidify British dominance and expansion. And in fact, imperial correspondents tended to refer to the war as the war between France and England, making no reference to the rebellion, the revolution. If you would advance, Elizabeth. Amman Broussard and the other troops on the Spanish side, along with Bernardo de Galvez, took Manchac, Baton Rouge, Natchez, and Mobile, what I was talking about before. James and Isabella and Bruce heard from the other side. The Spanish had taken these posts. And then Broussard and then the troops marched overland to join the siege of Pensacola in 1781. If you'll change the slide, Elizabeth, I will introduce you to the final person I want to talk about. Also coming toward Pensacola at the same time was a man named Alexander Mcgillivray. Now you can tell from his name, Alexander Mcgillivray had a Scottish father, but he also had a Creek mother. Creek lineality is matrilineal, and so by being born to a Creek mother, Alexander Mcgillivray, despite his name, that's his Scottish name, was fully Creek. He had a clan within the Crete Confederacy. Alexander Mcgillivray was born in Creek country, which is today Alabama and Georgia. At about 6, he went to Charleston with his father, who was a Scottish trader. But while he was there, the rebellion, and he was a young man, he'd grown to be a young man, the rebellion heated up. His father was a loyalist, and he was expelled from Georgia. So Alexander Mcgillivray and his sister, who was there too, rode on the back of a horse back to their mother's country, to Crete country. At the time of the American Revolution, the Crete Confederacy was a powerful confederacy, probably 10,000 or so people. And they were wary of settlers. The British assumed that the Creeks would be on the British side in this war because of settlers, British settlers, starting to try to move west onto Creek land out of Georgia and the Carolinas. But there was a great debate going on among the Creeks. Some Creeks believed that the British and their colonists should just be left alone to fight it out themselves. Even those who wanted to fight didn't particularly want to fight British targets that the British told them to. They particularly wanted to attack illegal settlements that were on Creek land. Creeks figured that, as one Creek leader put it in 1776, "I have sat quietly a long time without joining either party, but the Virginians," by which he meant Americans, right? "But the Virginians are now come very near my nation, and I do not want them to come any nearer." Now, the Creeks believed it was Britain's job to crack down on illegal settlements, that it was not something that the Creeks themselves should have to do. They believed Britain should keep its own colonists in line. But Creeks were willing to join the fighting as long as they could fight in their own way and against the targets that they chose. Britain needed the Creeks and other Indians, including the Choctaws and the Cherokees. Britain needed them on their side, but British military officials wanted Indians to fight their way. They wanted to tell Indians when to fight, tell them whom to fight, and perhaps most importantly, tell them when to stop fighting. Because, of course, British officials wanted the rebels to come back into the British Empire, right? And so the British officials are always doing this balance between, militarily defeating this rebellion, but also preparing the way to embrace these settlers back into the empire. Alexander Mcgillivray was appointed by Britain to be Britain's agent to the Creeks, within the Creeks, and part of his job was to try to persuade Creeks to fight on the British side against the Americans. Now, Alexander Mcgillivray wanted to fight for Britain. He believed the British Empire was the best protection for Creek independence against these encroaching colonists. He believed that the British Empire had the best opportunities for himself and his family, best economic opportunities as a trader and plantation owner, as he ended up being. And he also believed in this war he could prove himself as a warrior and as a leader. The first real test came in early 1779. There were many, many delays, but finally British forces opened up a southern campaign at the end of 1778. The British sailed with over 3,000 troops from New York to Savannah. British forces took possession of Savannah, and there they combined with 2,000 regular and loyalist militia forces from British East Florida, and their plan was next to secure the rest of Georgia, as the British commander put it, to take a stripe and star from the rebel flag of Congress. And then they planned to move north through the Carolinas and from there choke off the rebellion. Essential to the British Southern strategy was that the Creeks were supposed to attack from the west, and the Cherokees and Ohio native allies in the Ohio Valley were supposed to attack from the northwest, at the same time that the British Navy blockaded the Atlantic ports. Now, as soon as Mcgillivray and other Creek leaders received the news of the Southern campaign, that it had begun, they assembled war parties and headed toward Georgia, ready to join the fight. As Alexander left Creek country with 400 Creeks along the upper trading path, heading for Augusta on March 5th, 1779, he got a letter. This letter was from the British commander in Georgia, accusing the Creeks of not coming when they were called. Now, Mcgillivray had only gotten a letter telling them to come 2 weeks earlier, and the Creek towns were dispersed, that different towns and clans could make their own decisions about going to war. So he thought 2 weeks was pretty good, was pretty short time to have assembled this fairly large group of warriors and then have another one who was going to leave soon thereafter. What the British commander in Georgia didn't realize was that letters took at least a month to travel from New York, where it had been sent from, where the troops were coming from, British troops were coming from, New York, all the way around to Pensacola on the Gulf, and then 250 miles up into Creek country. The British commander had taken Savannah in December, then set off with 1,000 troops to Augusta on January 24th. But when he reached Augusta on January 31st, the original order for the Creeks had only made it as far as Pensacola. It would take another about 3 weeks to get into Alexander Mcgillivray's hands. Knowing none of this, the British troops waited for 2 weeks at Augusta, dangerously far from the protection of their base at Savannah, finally running low on provisions, hearing no word from the Creeks, the British forces abandoned Augusta on February 13th and backtracked toward Savannah. When the Creeks, who were on their way there, heard this news, they dispersed. Some went home. Many of them went in smaller war parties to attack settlements on Creek land. All this confusion made Alexander's job harder. In the spring of 1780, so a year later, Alexander Mcgillivray was trying to raise another party to raid the Georgia frontier when he received urgent news from West Florida's commanding general, John Campbell, that the Spanish had attacked Mobile. So this is this battle in 1780 before the Spanish will go to Pensacola. We'll go to Pensacola in 1781. So this is 1780. The Spanish have attacked Mobile. In this letter from Campbell's based at Pensacola, he asks Mcgillivray to send help as soon as he can. Now, this was a harder sell. For one thing, Creeks were much more interested in fighting Georgia settlers than fighting the Spanish, who weren't really coming onto Creek land. Or when they did come onto Creek land, they were coming with trade goods, not to stay. But Mcgillivray stressed Creek interests in the overall war, as well as the opportunities for glory on the Gulf Coast. And it worked. 600 Creek men came with Mcgillivray, and more were getting ready to come. But when Mcgillivray and the Creeks, along with a force of Choctaws, arrived in West Florida, Mobile had already fallen to the Spanish. The native warriors still expected British commander Campbell to receive them with gratitude as loyal allies, to host them with a feast and a formal ceremony. But instead, General Campbell sent word to them that he was sick. The warriors went home with tales of British incompetence and rudeness. And soon, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw delegations started going to meet with Spanish General Galvez. They told him they were frustrated with the British. They were considering severing ties with their British allies. Delegations went to Mobile, which was now under the Spanish, as well as to New Orleans to conduct diplomacy and receive supplies. Now, they weren't necessarily switching sides from Britain to Spain, but they were using this Spanish-British rivalry to whatever advantage they could for their own nation's independence. Now, General Campbell kept making things worse. 3 times he heard the Spanish were probably coming to try to take Pensacola, and he called native allies to come to their rescue to defend Pensacola. But a hurricane and other problems slowed down Galvez's attack on Pensacola. And Campbell had to send more messengers and say, no, don't come, really don't come. The British Indian Affairs official based at Pensacola wrote that Campbell does not understand anything of Indians or their affairs. He thinks they are to be used like slaves or people void of natural sense. Now, in fact, the Creeks and the Cherokees and the Choctaws and the Chickasaws were all powerful allies who needed to be courted and persuaded to align their own foreign policies with those of the British. As a result of the delays and Campbell's bumbling, most of them decided to let the Europeans fight their own battles. Elizabeth, if you would advance the slide. In the morning of March 8th, 1781, Spanish General Bernardo de Galvez led the first ship through enemy fire into the narrow opening of Pensacola Bay. For doing this, for being in the front of the ships, Galvez himself would get a commendation from the Spanish king, awarding him sort of this slogan of his own of "Yo solo," I alone led the ships. You can see in the Galvez coat of arms there that was created after this battle. There's a teeny tiny Bernardo de Galvez on a ship leading the other ships, supposedly right behind him, Yo solo into Pensacola Bay. Today, if you go to Pensacola, I've heard there's a new and more commanding statue since the last time I was able to go to Pensacola, but at least when I visited there, the only recognition of Galvez there was this bust of Galvez that says Yo solo, and it's in this very lonely park that I was the only person in and had a feeling I was the only person perhaps who'd been there for quite some time. So that Yo solo has a very different meaning that lonely park in Pensacola. But back in 1781, over the next 2 months, Spanish ships and troops besieged the British post of Pensacola. Alexander Mcgillivray finally rode into Pensacola on April 8th or so with about 40 Creeks, a far cry from the 600 who had ridden with him a year earlier. Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws simply didn't see much reason to come. On May 8th, Spanish artillery fire burst a hole in the main fort and Spanish forces poured in. General Campbell raised the white flag and surrendered Pensacola and all of the colony of West Florida to the Spanish. Now, the fall of Pensacola mattered for the end of the Revolution. In losing West Florida, Britain had lost a non-rebelling colony. The stakes of the war were ever increasing. Then the Spanish and a few French ships that had been besieging Pensacola during the battle, as soon as the British surrendered there, those ships were freed to go to the West Indies, freeing the French fleet to go to Yorktown and to be essential in winning, in defeating the British at Yorktown. The Spanish forces under Galvez and with the Spanish fleet then took the Bahamas, another British colony that had not rebelled, and were grouping to invade Jamaica, the most valuable colony in the British Empire. For those and other reasons, Britain decided to cut its losses and acknowledge American independence. If you could advance the slide one last time. The map of the continental United States today so neatly spreads from east to west that it would be easy to imagine, as 19th century Americans did, that it was the country's manifest destiny to stretch from sea to shining sea. But those are concepts from later in the 19th century. Francis Scott Key's 1814 Star-Spangled Banner has no continental wide lines like that. In fact, he was just hoping to hold on to Baltimore. More likely than US dominance over the continent was a patchwork of European colonies and sovereign nations, which might include French and Spanish, Spanish and British colonies, the 13 states if they held together, or perhaps separately if they broke apart, multiple native nations, maybe a pan-Indian confederacy in the Ohio Valley, other independent former colonies modeled on, but not necessarily part of the United States, and free Black colonies under the Spanish or British realm, which did happen briefly in this period. Whatever the configuration in the 1780s, it appeared that despite the changes of war, multiple sovereignties would continue across North America as different kinds of people continued to ally and fight for what they saw as their independence and opportunity. While there were some in the Spanish monarchy that worried that the United States might turn out not to be such a nation of Quakers, might actually become a threat on the continent, things generally looked promising for Spanish expansion. Spain's victories on the Gulf Coast and success in inspiring loyalty among French colonists like the Broussards promised a strong and growing Spanish presence in North America. James and Isabella Bruce were exiled from West Florida when the Spanish took over for being on the wrong side of the war, whereas the Broussards, who were on the winning side, built a prosperous life in Louisiana. In fact, the house of Amman and his wife now is the largest historic house on display in Lafayette, Louisiana, which of course is named for the French hero of the Revolution rather than the Spanish one. At the end of the 18th century, Creek Indians, as well as Chickasaws and Choctaws, believed that with careful diplomacy, they could cultivate Spain and perhaps even the United States as allies and continue to build peace with other native nations as they'd been doing in the years right around the Revolution. Much to all of their surprise, the small republic born of revolution would survive and expand to the Gulf Coast and beyond. But let's leave them there before all this happens, when none of them could see the future. Now, I think there is some time, a little bit of time for questions, if Karen wants to take over.
Thank you so much. That's just so interesting. And it made me realize how little we know about these stories, right? I mean, these are not things that we learn in our high school American Revolution units, right? I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about why it's important to add these stories and stories like these to this larger narrative that we have.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen. I think that's a good question. I think that some parts of it help us actually understand the revolution better. This fact that Britain isn't just fighting against, we sort of puzzle over how did these 13 very loosely united colonies defeat the greatest empire in the world? Well, because they had two other very powerful empires on their side, right? And so I think really understanding who wins the revolution and why, and how that affects the decades to come after the revolution is much easier to understand if you understand the revolution as a global war. Also, I think that one of the reasons I wrote this book was because the field of colonial American history has really broadened in the last, probably 50 years to, I think originally you could say it was really focused on New England and Virginia, and then it began to broaden its geographic scope to include sort of all the places that later become part of the United States. And also at the same time, in the aftermath of, inspired by the civil rights movement and other movements, to broaden the kinds of people who were actors in American history, and to think about a sort of multi-perspectival way of looking at history. But I found when I started this book, the American Revolution really hadn't had as much of that as the colonial period had. And so I really wanted to see, are there parts of the American Revolution that also can tell us, what did people think about independence? What did people want for their lives? What did they want for this place that became the United States in these years before those questions were decided?
Thank you. Such interesting food for thought and all of that. I have several people who've asked questions about your sources. So I wonder if you could briefly tell us about those, because you're finding such interesting stories.
Thank you. Yeah. So wars have sources, right? One of the good things about war, if you will, is that they make more sources, and especially in a period like the 18th century, where years can go by without people writing that much to leave for historians. So there are just all these archival papers from British side, the Spanish side, and the United States, and the rebels in the United States, that sort of form the basis of my sources. Now, because I wanted to talk about these individual people, I had sort of varying amounts of sources for different people, but questions about sources helped me decide who I would focus on, which would be the focus of the people I focus on. So Alexander Mcgillivray, for example, he's really important. So there are many reasons why I might have chosen him anyway as one of my central characters. But the reason, he's probably the very first one I picked, and that is because he actually wrote letters. So because he was trained in Charleston to be a merchant under his father, when he went back to Crete country, as a Creek warrior, Creek diplomat and leader, he wrote his own letters to Spanish and British and American officials. And so I knew that that's such a rare thing in this period to have written sources directly from a Native American. So I wanted him to be one of my sources. I also, one of the people I didn't talk about is an enslaved man in Mobile. And I chose him. He did not write any of his own documents, but he appears in Spanish sources a lot because he was actually a spy for the Spanish. And I came across him in just reading diplomatic correspondence between different officers in the Spanish army. So yeah, so I don't know, I could answer more questions about sources if there's specific ones, or if you want to go on to something else.
Thank you. You mentioned that there are 8 subjects in your book, and you talked about 4 of them tonight. I wonder if you could just briefly, for the for the benefit of people who will read your book, just go through a couple of the other ones.
Okay, great, great. I'd love to. So the one I just mentioned is a man named Petit Jean, he was enslaved in Mobile. His owner was French, and strangely enough, sort of his daily life in the years before the revolution had some similarity to Amman Broussard's, because he also was a cattle rancher. I mean, he was enslaved, so he had to do it as his owner told him to do in the sort of sick system of slavery. But he actually had a fair amount of autonomy day to day. His job was to mine the cattle outside of Mobile and then bring them in to be butchered when his owner wanted them. But when the Spanish took Mobile, somehow, and I don't know exactly how this happened, but they came across Petit Jean. I don't know if he volunteered or they found him in some other way, but quickly they realized, and he told them, that he knew the swamps and the land and everything around Mobile as well as anybody. So he became a sort of guide and a spy. He spied on the Chickasaw, he spied on the British for the Spanish. And he, to get back to the sources question about him, he appears in Spanish documents because of all this sort of action during the revolution, but then also after the revolution, because he is one of really thousands of enslaved people who get their freedom from the Spanish at the end of the war, either in return for service, as Petit Jean did, or many, many more of them actually bought themselves, like somehow were able to save up enough money for self-purchase. And so I tell his story over the course of the war and afterwards, and he manages to free his wife as well. And then my other characters are Paimataha, who is a Chickasaw leader, so also has some parallels with Alexander Mcgillivray, but is a generation older than he is a veteran of the 7 Years' War, and was part of this. I just briefly was able to mention the sort of peace movement, the diplomatic peace movement that goes on in among the Chickasaws and Choctaws and many other Native peoples in the inland of this region between the 7 Years' War and the Revolution and right after. And so his story is, in fact, much more one of peace. He tries to stay out of the revolution and to form alliances with other Native nations in this era. And then my last two are also a couple who were sort of the most American of any of the people. They were Irish, actually, Irish immigrants, Oliver Pollock and his wife, Margaret O'Brien Pollock, who lived in New Orleans and were sort of Atlantic merchants and supported the winning side in the revolution, helped to fund the American Revolution and persuade the Spanish to help the American Revolution more, but ended up losing their fortune over the course of the revolution.
Fascinating. Thank you. One last question, because we are running out of time, and it seems like a good one to end on. This is from a viewer named John, and he wants to know, what is your next book project?
Thank you. So I just submitted my manuscript to my editor of, it's a Native history book. It's a big picture Native American history from the 1100s, so before Europeans and Africans came to North America, through the 19th century with some connections to the 20th century and to today. And the main theme of it is the power of Native nations, particularly through this whole period, and is sort of, there's kind of this narrative of sort of rapid and almost destined decline of not only Native people, but particularly of their nations, their national status from kind of the moment Columbus arrives, right? And I really want to counter that and show Native power, how Native power and Native sovereignty continue well into the 19th century. And to use that to explain, today that the United States alone has more than 500 federally recognized nations, in addition to those in Mexico and Canada, in North America. And in some ways, the puzzle of the book is how did they survive? How did they survive as nations, and still be Native nations today under the United States? So it's a big picture book. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. And we will look forward to to that work as well, and we'll have to bring you back to talk about
That would be
it when
wonderful.
it's ready. Thank you so much for this intriguing talk. This has been really wonderful, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.